Nonconformity matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm your host, Ken Schachter, and on today's episode of Disrupting Hate on hmTV, we'll be joined via Zoom by special guest Jessica Levin. Jessica is the executive director of the nonprofit TEL Institute, a startup founded by writer Dara Horn. Dara is perhaps best known as the author of the provocatively titled People Love Dead Jews. The TEL Institute is designed to use education as a bulwark against anti-Semitism. The Institute is creating content and curriculum that explore the breadth of Jewish history and civilization, subjects conveniently neglected or erased. Jessica earned a bachelor's degree from Harvard College and a JD from Yale Law School. As the vice president of education for the new Harvard Jewish Alumni Alliance, she co-authored a report on Harvard's educational program. The report found that Harvard systematically planted and spread the seeds of hatred for Israel and Jews, starting well before Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel. So welcome, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So what specifically prompted the founding of the TEL Institute?
Yes. Well, Dara Horn and I met each other when we were both involved in Harvard after October 7th. She was serving on the Harvard Antisemitism Advisory Group, and I was leading up the education efforts for a new Harvard Jewish Alumni Alliance. And in my role, I researched everything Harvard was teaching about Jews and Israel. And that massive audit I did, Dara was able to see it before it was published because she was on my committee. She used some of that research for an article she wrote. And then she asked me to talk about a new nonprofit she was thinking about because I had spent 3 decades working and launching education nonprofit ventures and also shaping education policy. So that is how we met. She had also, even before October 7th, written an incredibly prescient article on is Holocaust education making things worse? And even before that article, she had been traveling around the country, lecturing and presenting after she published People Love Dead Jews, testing out a new approach for educating about Jewish civilization and anti-Semitism. And one thing that happened to her when she would lecture is people would come up to her after begging them for anything to take back to their schools and community. So she knew that the demand was there. She also knew that her ideas could change people's minds, which, as we know, is a rarity in the modern world. So the combination of those things led to the launch of the TEL Institute.
Now, the Institute maintains that it's essential to understand who Jews are to fight anti-Semitism. What does that look like?
So that is a foundational part of what we're trying to do, because right now so many people only learn about Jews as Europeans who died in the Holocaust, and they study from 1933, let's say, to 1945. But our fundamental premise is you can't understand anything about Jews, the Holocaust, or contemporary anti-Semitism unless you understand the story of the Jewish people, as a tiny countercultural minority that would not bow down to tyrants. And in that was expressed as monotheism, which we think of it as a religious idea, that only worshiping one God. But for the Jews in the ancient world, it was also a political idea that meant we don't bow down to people, especially tyrants. And so what we teach about is that Jewish civilization has always been an anti-tyrannical movement, a non-hierarchical movement, a non-conformist movement, and grounded in a liberation story that shows that freedom is possible, but also in laws and the values of civil discourse and dissent that emphasize the importance of responsibility in addition to freedom. And we think this is one of the greatest stories on earth. And in part because how these groundbreaking ideas that Jews had influenced them and their survival, but also how these ideas shaped the world. And so it's only when you understand these ideas that then you understand the next step, which is the profound threat these ideas posed to tyrants and dominant societies. Because if you have a group that will not bow down to tyrants, you piss off tyrants. And if you have a group that will not conform to dominant society, you piss off dominant society. And so what we show is both the ideas, the threat that those ideas pose, and then how anti-Semitism is inextricably linked to that threat, because the response of those tyrants and dominant societies is what we call the big lie of anti-Semitism. And I can go into that with you, but we don't teach that anti-Semitism is a bias, a prejudice, a conspiracy theory. We teach it as a lie. We call it the big lie, and we show how it has endured for over 2,000 years and how the question of who Jews are is completely linked to the development of that lie by people who are threatened by Jewish ideas.
Fascinating, and that goes a long way toward toward explaining why Jews tend to be such rebels in various ways.
Yes, and one of the things that's extremely important to us is that people understand what tyranny looks like. Because when I grew up, for example, we all knew by watching the Soviet Union what a true tyrannical government looked like and why any dissent was such a threat to them, such that they would throw even a single dissenter in jail or even kill them. And it's hard for us to understand that today, but one of the things we teach is understanding why there are regimes that cannot tolerate anyone protesting what they say or what they do. So that is a foundational element of understanding the Jewish story.
Now, can you explain how you chose the concept of the TEL and what the archaeological image?
Yes. So the TEL has a double meaning to us because on one level, we're telling a story, we're telling it like it is. A TEL also can imply a lie in poker. But we also think of a TEL as an architectural TEL, like a TEL. It's a hill built on layers of civilization. And that is the image we're trying to create, and also the story we're telling of a civilization that's lasted thousands of years, built upon itself with layers of storytelling and memory and persecution and resilience and continuity. And this is the image we want people to have with them as we take them down the levels of the TEL and then back up to living Jews today.
Interesting. I think there are many Jews themselves who don't appreciate the scope of Jewish history, and it's really a global story, I think.
Yeah, I think that that's something, obviously starting in the land of Israel, and how then, with the destruction of the Second Temple, Jews spread across the world. And people think then that it was just to Europe, but it was also to the Middle East, where there were many thriving Jewish communities with large numbers of Jews. And we tell this story as a global story.
Yeah, what are some of the things that are the least understood, or the biggest gaps in terms of knowledge of Jewish civilization?
Let me just take a step back and just tell you a little more how we're trying to teach this story. We believe that the vast majority of people are ignorant, not malicious. And so we don't view this as a PR problem or a communications problem. We view this as an education crisis. And so what we have done is we have created 8 lessons, and that's it. These 8 lessons tell the story of who Jews are, the threat the Jewish ideas I discussed pose to tyrants and dominant societies, and then the big lie of anti-Semitism as the response. And we are saying we do not want to reinvent the wheel. We want this story to be the start here for everyone else teaching about Jews and the Holocaust and contemporary anti-Semitism. And so we already have developed these lessons and accompanying training. And then we have developed different editions for different audiences, starting with middle and high school students. And so many things about this story surprise people. Obviously, there's just Jews, the how old Jewish people are, and their incredible survival, and what that took, and the pivot that took to be able to survive in the diaspora. And that is just a fascinating story for people to learn. Obviously, people are riveted by these ideas because of their impact on world religions and America and, liberation movements like the Civil Rights Movement. And then the third thing, I think, what we do to teach about the big lie of anti-Semitism is we have 5 different case studies from 40 CE to 2001. And each of these case studies documents how the big lie works. And we define the big lie as Jews are destroying whatever a society cares about the most. And the only thing that changes is what society cares about the most. And the conclusion is always, because they are destroying what society cares about the most, Jews deserve to be eliminated or destroyed. And so what happens is when we take them through how the blood libel works, or how Henry Ford used the big lie in America, how the Soviet Union used the big lie to create the tropes we hear about Israel today. And we have a framework that people can read case studies and actually ask the questions: who is the power? What does society care about most? How are Jews destroying what they care about most? And then we also have a piece on what is the media that is used at the time to accelerate the spread of the big lie. Because we want to take that question about the media up to the present day so that students have a better understanding of how media spreads this lie. And I'll just say 2 other things. We have piloted our training linked to this story with teachers and principals, many of them non-Jewish teachers and principals, and even in Title I, high poverty schools. And we've gotten some incredible feedback. One woman, after hearing about Am Yisrael for 30 minutes, basically said to us, "You mean this is a tiny group of people who wanted to be left alone and no one would leave them alone?" And she figured that out after 30 minutes of this story. And then someone else, an African-American principal of a Title I school, basically told us practically in tears, "I have to bring this story back to my students." Because it's a story not just of persecution, but resilience and survival. And this is one of the reasons this story is so compelling for everyone and not just Jews.
It certainly resonates. Now, can you tell me, in this age, we have new media sources, obviously social media and other sources, and how has that played in the to as a way perhaps of explaining who Jews are, or perhaps of spreading anti-Semitism?
Yes. Well, I think the great thing about our lessons is it shows even before you had social media, which has only facilitated the spread of lies. The newest media of each era played its role in spreading the big lie of anti-Semitism very effectively for the time. Whether that was the printing press or newspapers or radio or TV. And so we take people through in our case studies how that works. And that then brings us to present media. And we want people to recognize how present media works to spread the big lie by we have a lesson introducing a case study and asking, how do we know if this is true or not? How do we know if what we're reading and seeing is true? And we introduce concepts like the illusory truth effect that holds that the more times a lie is repeated, the more someone believes it, even they start out not thinking it is true. And the important thing that we are trying to do, which I really like and appreciate, is we are not trying to replace one truth with another. We do not even know if that's possible in the current media environment. We are just trying to create a little space between what people see and hear and what they think, because we think in that space is where skepticism and then curiosity can grow. And that is the most important takeaway we want for anyone who learns the story we're telling, is how can we be more skeptical of what we read? How can we understand the dynamics of the big lie so that we are not duped? And how can we be curious about living Jews? Those are our goals. And they may sound modest, but we think they are goals that basically prepare people to live and fight for freedom and pluralism in the modern world.
Perhaps the most important tool is a dose of skepticism, and just using the noggin and try and not accepting whatever you hear on social media.
And I don't think that's just a challenge for students. I think that is a challenge for all of us. And I think that where you see some of the gap between older people and younger people, obviously, is older people for whom first of all, they're closer to when the Holocaust happened. They know many more survivors. But the second thing is, because of our exposure to the Soviet Union, for example, we understand the power of propaganda in a way I think may be harder for younger people to understand. At the same time, I think we may not be as vulnerable as younger people, but we also are vulnerable, and we are also in our own silos that are created for us by the social media algorithms. So this, I think, is a societal-wide problem. But fortunately, some of the ideas we introduce to students and to teachers, and some of the tools Jews have had for thousands of years, are even more relevant to this current moment. We think especially around civil discourse and dissent, because those are the vehicles in which people can get closer to what is reality and what are lies.
Some activists maintain that they are merely anti-Zionist against the state of Israel and not anti-Jew. How does the TEL Institute counter that argument?
This is a question that's particularly important to me. And I have to admit, I stumbled on the origins of anti-Zionism when I was researching what Harvard was teaching about Jews in Israel. Because I saw these same tropes over and over again. Israel's a racist state. Israel's a genocide colonial state. Israel is an apartheid state. Israel's committing genocide. Terrorists are freedom fighters. And those tropes basically were in Harvard's courses. They had speaker after speaker come in and actually lecture with those tropes. And knowing Israel, my question was, where is this coming from? I had to understand where it was coming from, which took me down the path of learning about Soviet anti-Zionism. I'm going to get to that in a second. I'll explain how that works. But first, yes, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, they use different words. One seems to be about Israel, one seems to be about Jews. But the bottom line is they both are ideologies of Jew hate that function the same way. And that is the value of learning about anti-Semitism or Jew hate as a lie and understanding how the pattern works. Because once you understand how the pattern works, you don't get to say, I'm not a bigot because I only want half the world's Jews to die. Do you understand? If you understand how anti-Zionism works, you know how often it ends in violence and even destruction of Jewish communities wherever they are. And so arguing about whether anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, for us, that's not even the right question because they both conform to this same pattern that always leads to the elimination or destruction of Jews. And so a few things we say is, if people say, well, then I can't criticize Israel. And our response is, well, if you think anti-Zionism has anything to do with criticizing Israel, you actually don't know what anti-Zionism is. Because anti-Zionism has nothing to do with criticizing Israel. And that is a foundationally important point. Like, Israelis criticize Israel more than anyone else possibly could. And if you think that, if you don't know the story of who were the first rulers who said anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, which happened to be Russian rulers in the early 20th century when they killed thousands of Jews, calling them Zionists. This was even before Israel was formed. If you don't know that, and you don't know about how one of the most terrible, murderous, tyrannical governments in the world, the Soviet Union, invented these tropes about Zionism is racism, Zionism is colonialism. If you don't know why they invented it and how they spread those tropes actually to the West, to the progressives, and to academia. Actually, it was during the Cold War, it was even less to undermine Israel than to undermine that alliance and to undermine America during the Cold War. So what we're actually saying is, people can say anti-Semitism is not anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, but the vast majority of people, this is a matter of education. And are we brave enough to tell this story that we're telling? And our view is the vast majority of people, they just don't know this because they haven't been taught it. And quite the opposite. They have been flooded with these mantras, especially after October 7th.
What would success look like, say, 5 years from now, for the TEL Institute from the perspective of a student or a school?
There are several ways we define this. Okay. One is we want it to be as normal for students to know about who Jews are as they know about the Holocaust. That is a foundational goal of ours. We want them to know about the groundbreaking ideas of Jews and how that contributed to their own persecution, but also their survival and to the world at large. That is critical. And we very consciously are not trying to persuade the unpersuadables. We know there are people for whom their anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, they are unpersuadable. And there are multiple reasons that might be. So we are targeting the people who actually are persuadable and want to be educated. And as we've seen, how open they are to this story once they understand it. Because people also really don't want to be duped. And so this story actually says how we're all actually being duped and explains why. For Jewish students in particular, it is, I think, a very hard time to be a Jewish student, especially a non-Orthodox Jewish student. And the pull of these narratives is very, very compelling. So if we don't inoculate our children to those lies and to what are the core aspects of the Jewish people, they inevitably are very vulnerable to them. But we believe once you learn this story, not only are you less vulnerable to the lies, you are better able to embrace your Jewish identity and the Jewish community. For example, we did a training, Dara led a training in New Jersey for actually an independent school. And a Jewish teacher came up to us after and said, "You have given me a reason to feel proud of being Jewish again." Because how can you be proud of being Jewish when all around you, you're being told that Jews are like the worst of white oppressors, right? Because when I was working in the education world, I actually saw pyramids, the oppressor-oppressed pyramids, with white Jews at the top of the pyramid. Okay, so on one hand, you have that narrative. And the other hand, you have the Jewish homeland that's supposedly the worst of the world's evils. And what our children have to understand is there's a reason the whole world is focusing on a country you can't even find on the map. Why is that? You know, when Israel was created, 22 Arab countries were created. Okay? The story of Israel and Zionism is the same story as hundreds of other national movements in the late 19th, early 20th century. That, you know, and this story led to massive population displacements, massive amounts of death, bloodshed. And yet, there's no like free Pakistan movement. There's no free anything movement except for free Palestine. And why is that? And this is the story people have to understand.
That's a wonderful place to leave it at. I'm afraid our time is up, but thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate talking with you.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Disrupting Hate on hmTV. Many thanks to our guest, Jessica Levin, for sharing her insights. This episode was directed by Bernie Fershpan. Be sure to subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations. And until next time, take care and be well.